Good morning, all. There's a bit of a lag today, so bear that in mind. I'll deal with comments and so on at the end, as per usual. You know the shtick of the day, of the show, of the whole thing is that I am reacting to the news pretty much as soon as I read it, while being thoroughly ill-informed. Which is kind of what all YouTube commentators are, but I'm upfront about it. And coronavirus is the new Brexit because it's all anyone talks about it. It impacts every single story, it seems like. Yeah, so let's get into it. Oh, and Sneak or Monster or Relentless, if you want to sponsor the show, that would be lovely. Right. So obviously I'm in the UK, so UK news features quite bigly in my concerns. And our government is not just incompetent in all of this crisis, they are actively, it seems, setting out to hurt people. So they're pressing ahead with a lot of legislation and other issues. Largely, I think, because they think they can get away with it, particularly the controversial stuff, while the ongoing crisis goes and stays critical, if you will. And one of the big ones is this flagship immigration policy that they've got. So they want to repeal the EU freedom of movement rules. When that will take effect, I don't know. I don't think it can until we're actually fully, officially out after the transition period. And they haven't had a particularly good track record on this. The whole problem, the Windrush scandal, look it up. Basically, people who came over here at government invitation to work from Jamaica and other West Indian nations in the 60s and 70s. Legislation they brought in a while ago ended up telling a lot of those people who by this point were grandparents that they had to leave, and requiring paperwork that hasn't existed for like decades. So that thing was a huge clusterfuck, particularly in London. Right. Now, this is supposed to end freedom of movement, which isn't the big deal that everyone says it is. We've always had control over our borders and so on. We've just chosen, for some reason, not to enforce it. So it's a big charade, or charade, depending how you want to pronounce it. Me being from the south of England, from the home counties, pronounces it as charade. But they're going to do it anyway. Right? And then this new thing gets rid of freedom of movement, which is pointless. Gets rid of low-skilled immigration, which is some of the largest amount of immigration that we need. And this is just like a sop to the right wing of the party. To fully contextualise how stupid this is, you have to keep in mind that even before coronavirus and before Brexit, we were having a hard time getting enough labour in this country to pick all the crops and everything that needs doing. Now, we're not really anywhere near self-sufficient on food anyway, but obviously if you've got environmental concerns about carbon from travel and shipping and so on, then this is a big thing. If you've got any sort of pride in British produce, this is a big thing. And we're starting to sort of slide into Britain's main sort of producing periods of the year. And despite coronavirus, we have been making special flights to bring in pickers from the continent lately. And they're still going to push this through. It's not in the national interest. It's certainly not in the UK's interest diplomatically overseas. It's just something they've kind of cornered themselves into. But there's no need to do this during this crisis. You know, it can wait. We need these people now more than ever, and they still want to push ahead with it. And of course the EU negotiations appear to be breaking down, and the government's come out completely against any kind of extension to the negotiations as well at this point, despite a global pandemic knocking everything off its feet. just the sheer bloody stupidity. But the trouble is, you become inured to it the same way you kind of do to Trump, I guess. Oh, what he said we should inject bleach. Trump gonna be Trump, and it's kind of the same thing with the Tories here. They're always going to be horrendous people and do things regardless. I guess they figure the longer they leave it, the less likely they'll be able to push it through. I don't know. And they want to keep people quiet. Who knows? A lot of concern has been spread about exactly how much all of this shutting down and everything is going to cost us. And there's an article on the BBC news site asking that very question. Obviously, given the shtick of the show, I haven't actually seen whether they go into it so much. But so let's have a look. Coronavirus has brought large parts of the economy to a standstill, and the government has had to spend billions to support workers, businesses, and the NHS. I've applied for the small business support. Now, it's not completely free. You have to pay tax on it, and it's considered towards your earnings in the next year, and you can't get it unless you filed in previous tax years. So if you're a new startup who are arguably the most vulnerable and the most likely to sink at the moment, you can't really apply to it because you won't have put in your tax information for previous years. But when I applied for it, it was a pretty easy process because I pretty diligently and early do my taxes. So I'm getting about I think £1,200, which is about 80%. It's less than 80% of 3 months' earnings on a reasonably typical year. Actually, that's a fairly bad year. So, yeah, but it's help. It's needed. But I don't actually know how badly off I am. I can't actually tell yet how badly everything's affected my business, because there was a rush on buying ebooks and games and stuff at the beginning of the pandemic, but I've seen a collapse in sales since. But I'm not overall sure how badly off I'm doing because of coronavirus, because in their infinite wisdom, Lulu.com, who handles all my print-on-demand stuff and sells for me through Amazon, because I haven't got on too well with Amazon's print-on-demand in the past. I'm sure it's improved since then, but still. They decided to roll out an update, a wholesale update to their site, largely prompted by Flash going away, and it hasn't gone well. It hasn't really worked, and it's not propagating sales data properly, so I can't actually tell how much I'm up or down, and I can't pay people royalties until I get that information, so I'm completely fucking stuck. But yeah, so I don't know how badly off I am, so I applied for it anyway. As far as I can tell from the automated system, I've got it. I should get it within the next 4 to 5 working days. So that's a big relief either way. And if I don't need it, I'll just end up paying more taxes because I won't spend the money. And you know me, I'll pay it forward. But yeah, back to the article. The BBC reckons that the extra spending around coronavirus is about £300 billion. That's very roughly $450 billion US. Very roughly. I don't think it's 1.5 because the conversion ratio, which is what it typically is, because the pound's had a bit of a collapse, but then so has the dollar. So who knows? But that's a huge amount of money. And most of it's come from borrowing. Before the crisis, the government was expecting to borrow about £55 billion. Because this is the case around the world, which softens the blow somewhat, because everybody is suffering these financial problems. No one particular country ends up being the victim, though I suspect that as we move forward, this is actually going to strengthen what has been a weakening Chinese position, and a lot of the other tiger economies as well, because they tend to have coped better with this because they had fair warning from SARS and other issues. So, yeah, we'll see. I also think the impact has been blunted by the fact that so many people now can work from home, and emergency workers, or what do they call them, essential workers, have been somewhat insulated and have had somewhat readier access to testing, but we'll see. But it's a lot of money, and they're also going to raise less tax. So they reckon that by the end of the year, this could be as high as £350 billion. I'm rounding it up, to be fair, because it's usually worse than they say. And even if the pandemic ends quickly, we're likely to see a recession, though most economic forecasts suggest that everything will bounce back fairly quickly. It's not like all that economic activity just disappeared. It's all there. It's just it can't be exercised. And it depends how many businesses go bust. And if they do, that's just going to create opportunities either for larger businesses to move into those spaces or for new small businesses to pop up. So most economic forecasts predict a fairly rapid bounce back once all this is over. But they're going to have to get this money from somewhere. So what they're trying first is to raise money from wealthy individuals, companies, pension funds, and foreign governments who will essentially buy bonds in the UK government. So when you buy a bond, you're saying, okay, you're a safe enough bet. I will buy a certain amount of value in your country, essentially, knowing that will get bought back in the future with interest. One idea I've seen bandied about was, if you remember back in the well, you won't remember, but if you remember from your history lessons from the First and Second World War, the idea of bonds, war bonds, was opened up to the general public. So if you were someone who had a bit of extra cash, you could show your patriotism and invest in your country by buying war bonds. So that's an idea that's been bandied about in some areas, that this is essentially a war footing without the explosions. I think more people in the US have now died from coronavirus than died from the whole Vietnam War. So, so the idea of some sort of patriotic virus bond has been bandied about and strikes me as being a reasonably sensible idea. If you can invest in your country and get the money paid back with interest, that might be appealing to a lot of people. I don't have a patriotic. I don't have a patriotic bone in my body, really. But it seems like a decent way to help offset some of the crisis. Taxation is also the other thing to consider. This government is likely to double down on austerity, which didn't work and hasn't worked. And the kinds of people who talk about the balance between people who die from the virus and people who die from any recession and so on, you look to austerity and that's what makes you think that can cause deaths, right? The previous 10 years of austerity, which we were just coming out of, killed about 150,000 people over 10 years. So that's about 15,000 people per year, which is a lot less than the coronavirus. What's the current death toll? Get your body lotto tickets ready. Tonight's numbers are 34,636. So the equivalent of about 2 years of austerity, over 2 years of austerity in less than 6 months. So yeah, that tells you a lot. Not quite all you need to know, but a lot. Austerity will cause a lot of problems depending on how long it goes on for, but basically we can have 2 years of austerity and it would still have been worth it in raw, grim calculus of casualties. I'll get to questions and comments at the end. I seem to be going on about this one quite a lot, but it is quite a complicated issue. A lot of people are saying like a one-off wealth tax. The Conservatives are unlikely to go for that. Some talk about income tax, which is slightly fairer depending how it's distributed. National insurance, which would be a small rise for everybody who's employed. So that's that's something that could be looked at. It's not very progressive though, because it will hit the poorest people the most. VAT would be the worst option. That's sales tax for Yanks. that tends to penalise poor people more, because a higher proportion of your income when you're poor is spent on things upon which you get taxed VAT, whereas if you're very wealthy, once you've bought everything you need, you don't need to buy much else, you know? State pensions they're talking about, that seems like a bad idea. Cutting, like I say, that seems like a bad idea. Austerity just didn't work. Debt went up anyway, and the amount of hardship that it caused was stupid. There are other approaches where you actually do a lot of spending, and that can seem counterintuitive, but if you go back to, again, the previous Great Depression and so on, what got us out of that was initially massive government spending and investment in infrastructure and projects and wealth, the foundations of the welfare states and so on, and then war. War is less than ideal, but it is massive government spending, and that's what ended the Great Depression. So, if we can avoid war and do the same thing, like the New Deal and so on, that's a lot better. This government, they're very likely to double down on austerity and tax the poor. And that's just the way it is, and they're going to get away with it because they don't have to do anything else for about 3 more years. You've got to wonder whether the Northerners are starting to get buyer's remorse having voted Tory. Oi, Gewalt. Right. There's been a big randomised test in the UK using coronavirus tests. They've tested 11,000 people across the UK, and right now about 1 in 400 people has coronavirus. So, let me just work something out here. Okay, a standard British Rail train carries can carry about 427 people, 52 in first class, 373 in standard seats, 719 standing in 8 cars. So let's assume that as a UK standard train. Add all that together. So on an average commuter train, 3 to 4 people will have coronavirus. And if you've seen those statistics from Chinese contact tracing, right, and you assume a rammed carriage, which is pretty likely because they're running a reduced service, yeah, a lot of people are going to get sick very quickly if we open up too quickly. 1 in 400 doesn't sound very much, but if you consider it in terms of railway carriages, I think the problem rapidly becomes obvious. Now, without controls, without social distancing, without all of these things, I think it's each person infects 1.3 people, which makes it 10 times in less than a week, if I remember correctly. So, yeah, be concerned. Be concerned. It doesn't sound like a lot, but you have to relate it to real life to really understand what it's like. So there's this image from contact tracing in a Chinese restaurant. I mean, a restaurant in China, not a Chinese restaurant, where they know that one person had it, and then they traced the amount of other people, and that was in an enclosed space with air conditioning, and that one person infected 3 to 4 other people. I can't remember exactly, over the course of a meal in an enclosed environment. Now is not the time to be lifting things, but people are already acting like it's all already been lifted, and we're going to see a spike in about another week of infections. It's good that only 0.27% of the UK appears to have coronavirus. Yeah, that's a reasonably good sample size for accurate data, but still, if you actually think about it, it shows how much of a problem we're of. We're seeing a lot of concern from a lot of people who aren't normally concerned about the poor and about the working class and I don't necessarily believe them. They only seem to be concerned when it suits their agenda, which is to get people back to work. So you'll see a lot of people saying, "Well, it's all right for you and your middle class bubble, working from home on your computer. What about the poor people who have to go out and do manual labour?" Well, a lot of gig workers and manual workers are already out or have already been out still working since the start, because a lot of that work is essential. It's just not compensated like it's essential. But one of these stories here does demonstrate a middle class bubble, and with people working from home, with kids studying from home, what they're finding is that better off children are studying more than poorer pupils. This is also true at normal times, and the current problem has also thrown up the technology gap as well. If you're in a poorer home, you're less likely to have a computer. If you do have a computer, it's less likely to be good. You're less likely to have decent broadband. Both of your parents are more likely to be working, so you don't have anyone to help you with your studying or your homework, or even to be around to encourage you to do it yourself, and even in times like this. So it's not that middle class and upper class children are more diligent or more intelligent or whatever else. It's these compounding factors. And this is an example of a genuine form of privilege. People have abused the term so much that it's become virtually meaningless. But here we have something that is genuinely a case of privilege. Because poorer kids are losing their right to education, which is enshrined in law here, up to age 16, I believe. And a right is a privilege. The wealthier kids, they are privileged in this instance, unfortunately. But there's not a lot you can do about it, and this is the case outside of coronavirus as well. Like Brexit, coronavirus is just throwing up all these instances of where there are problems in our society. Genuine, systemic, society-wide problems, even more so in the States, because you've got a medical crisis that's also leading to mass redundancy, and most people in the US rely on their job for their medical coverage. So, but are we likely to see any kind of shift on universal healthcare in the US? It's been popular with the populace for a very long time, but neither party seems that keen. Certainly not the candidates for the next presidential election, so I wouldn't hold your breath. Unless you're avoiding someone with coronavirus, in which case holding your breath might be a good idea. Uncharacteristically for me, I just want to give mad props to Archbishop Justin Welby, who says austerity would be catastrophic. And yes, it would, and it's not the only approach we can take to these issues. So, big up yourself, Justin Welby. Austerity would be catastrophic. Not that anyone's ever listened to you in government in the past, so yeah. But every voice is welcome. I have a few friends in Brazil and across South America. Pundits in Uruguay, which is another country in South America, which doesn't have very many coronavirus cases at all, at least officially. And he's constantly crowing about that fact. But I think it's due largely to the fact that Uruguay is a bit of a backwater. They had more warning than a lot of other countries. They have taken certain measures. But if you want to see somewhere else to demonstrate how big the problem can be, particularly if you don't take it seriously, which is what, unfortunately, pundits been suggesting, that shutting down and taking appropriate measures isn't the right thing to do, you can look to Brazil, which is another South American country, but obviously one that's more populous, more built up, and has a lot more travel. I think that's the major difference between them and Uruguay. But I have friends in Brazil, including a couple of medical workers, and I am very, very concerned about them. So I've been paying attention to news from Brazil. They've been digging mass graves. And hospitals in Sao Paulo, it's reported, are near collapse. And none of this has been helped by the fact that Bolsonaro, their infamous Trumpian right-wing leader has been going around acting like it's no big deal, not wearing a mask, pressing the flesh with the public, all the kind of stuff that you expect a populist to do, giving exactly the wrong example, to the point where some reports coming out of the country suggest that there has actually been a soft coup and Bolsonaro is just being ignored by all the governments, all the local authorities, and essentially someone else is running the country, and he's just being left to sound off and talk bollocks as much as he wants. I don't know whether that's true or not. My friends in Brazil are a bit... Well, we don't really know. We don't know what's going on, but they're scared. And this just goes to show what happens if you have a government like Bolsonaro that doesn't take this seriously. We should not be opening up again. I hope they're okay. Shout out if you're watching, guys. So my mental health problems and sometimes incapacity to work means that I am on certain benefits: personal independence payment and employment support allowance. PIP helps me pay for things like personal travel or food when I don't feel up to it, can't get myself out of bed, or can't face public transport, that sort of thing. That's not actually that much. ESA is a support payment where you are working, but you can't necessarily work enough to support yourself. So ESA is very important, very useful. So I have an interest in disability payments. Again, like Brazil, I have disabled friends who rely on these payments. A lot of people who, like me, are on certain payments, but were working, all right, so this supports them in working. A lot of people in that situation have found themselves unemployed, which means they're now applying for unemployment assistance, which means across much of the country they're being forced onto universal credit. But what they're finding is that when they apply for universal credit, because they're now unemployed, that takes them onto universal credit and off the old system, and that actually means they get less money. So they're in crisis, they've lost their job, they've lost their income, they're currently having a small amount of monetary support that isn't really enough. They apply for job seekers allowance, or whatever they call it now, and they actually end up with less money from going for help. So I would just really, really caution anybody, not that enough people watch this show for it to make a difference, but really think and ask yourself if it's worth it to go on universal credit. Now, there are various charities and groups that have websites where you can enter your current details and they can tell you what you'll likely end up with on universal credit. There are claim checkers that are more official that you can go through as well. Do that first before you apply, because you could be in for a real shock. I know that if I went onto universal credit, I would lose at least half, possibly 2/3 of my support income. And whether you think that's scrounging or whatever or not, I think you should probably agree that abruptly losing 2/3 of your income, particularly during a financial crunch and crisis, is not really useful or helpful for anybody. So I would really, really, really worry about applying for universal credit, even if you're really hard up. Cut back, find some other way to make money, hustle, whatever you can do, but going on to universal credit is probably going to do you over if you're already on any kind of monetary support, whether it's tax credits, council tax relief, ESA, PIP, whatever else. If you're on the old system, it's just not worth your while going on to universal credit. Covered that. Keir Starmer, new leader of the Labour Party, replacing Jeremy Corbyn. He's not quite all the way back to Blair, but he is a shift back towards the centre to an extent. And he seems a very capable politician. Now, he's a former lawyer. He's really good at cross-examination and so on, and he has been eviscerating Boris at the dispatch box during Prime Minister's questions and so on. He's who I wanted to lead Labour, not for ideological reasons necessarily, but for pragmatic reasons. Because he's a lesser evil, he's very capable, he's proven in the last couple of weeks to be largely immune to right-wing tabloid attacks that have just backfired. He's the right guy at the right time. It's not enough because there's not going to be another election for 4 years. I mean, I wouldn't want an election during the coronavirus anyway, but there's a risk of accidental competence from this government. For example, they've already committed to producing millions upon millions of vaccine injections of a slightly promising inoculation against the coronavirus. So if our scientists and so on, who the government have been ignoring, pull through and do something amazing and get us a genuinely useful vaccination in really short time, because we probably shouldn't be expecting one till the middle of next year. If they pull that off, then the government is likely to reap the political benefits of that, which they don't deserve, which will probably remove our chance of removing the Tories. I don't want anyone to die, but looking long term, we've got to get rid of this government. And while it'd be a great thing if our scientists and research institutes and so on do manage to crack a vaccine before anyone else, be good for the country too, the government will take undue praise for doing that and will likely stay in. I'm hoping that we can steer through this crisis and hold populist right-wing governments to account as we come out of this. I hope so. I hope we can do both. And I guess if we can save lives anyway, it's worth enduring more Tories. I did survive Thatcher after all. I covered that. Piracy is up. That's just an interesting note. Probably because a lot of people who can't afford Netflix and so on, who are out of work, are turning to piracy as a way of handling it. I do wonder if the ISPs are going to crack down as hard as they would in peacetime or not. People are worried about mental health issues. Now, I'm not an expert, but I have mental health issues, and they do include suicidal ideation, self-harm, things like that. And a lot of people are citing mental health issues as a reason to lift the lockdown early. But here's the thing, right? There is a tangible, real crisis here that we can point at and we can blame and we can say, yeah, this is the issue. It's not my fault, right? And it's not your fault if you're out of work. It's the virus, right? So I don't think we're going to see a spike in suicides to anything like the extent that they're talking about. We will, but I don't think it's going to be anything like the amount of people we've lost to the coronavirus. I need to step away for a minute. I will be right back. food delivery. Right. Okay, something that I think more people need to be aware of when it comes to coronavirus that they're not aware of is just how many other issues it causes. I reposted on, I think, Twitter and Facebook a video showing people in Wales recovering from the virus. And some people collapse with it and have broken limbs and so on. Intubating can often create dangerous blood clots, or the virus itself can cause dangerous blood clots. There's long-term physiotherapy and other issues that need to be thought about. And a lot of people aren't facing up to that. Aren't understanding that it's not just, okay, you get it, you have the flu. Maybe in extreme cases you have to go into hospital. You get put on a ventilator till you get better and then you go home. No. Right? There's a lot of physiotherapy and long-term assistance. And there may be long-term effects that we don't really know anything about. There's also a multiple organ failure syndrome that appears to be linked to coronavirus that is affecting children, even though the virus itself doesn't affect them. So it is way too soon to be opening schools until we know what's going on, right? Unless you regard child deaths at some small rate even to be acceptable. There's a whole host of other stuff. We just don't know enough about this virus to really know what the long-term effects of it are. But it's a lot more than just having the flu and getting over it, or even having pneumonia and getting over it. It's a lot of problems. And all these people insisting that you shouldn't record comorbid issues as being coronavirus issues. That's like saying, oh, well, he was drunk, but it was the lamppost striking him on the head that killed him when he crashed his car into it. The drink had nothing to do with it. It's so stupid. So stupid. Gove said it's safe to reopen schools. It's not. Well, that's pretty much all the things that caught my eye. So let's have a look at your comments. Ladles and jelly spoons. Where is it? There we go. Right, so get your questions in now because there's a bit of a lag. Aaron says, hope you get it. Hope he's meaning the money that I was talking about at the beginning and not the virus, which I may have already had. Morning Ben, morning Sonic. How's Charlie Cat doing? Charlie Cat, we were a bit worried about him for a while because he wasn't eating or moving very much, but we got some special food in and he's eating that like a pig and starting to put some weight back on. Still not moving around much. We're waiting on a cat harness, which he won't like. So we can sort of take him outside and let him sniff around a bit. But he's fairly happy just sat on the couch with my other half all day, being made a fuss of and being spoiled rotten. So he's all right. Ben Frowny faces more debt, which is how most governments are going to deal with this crisis. Debt isn't necessarily bad, it's how you spend it. And one good thing, I guess, about a lot of the money that's been dished out from all this is that a lot of it, despite America's sort of corporate bailouts, a lot of it has gone to ordinary people, which means it'll be spent, so it will actually stimulate the economy, if anything. So, yeah. Ben says 50% chance of someone in your carriage carrying the disease. Yeah, pretty much. And that's a situation in which masks aren't terribly helpful unless the person with it is wearing it. Then they're slightly less likely to pass it on. So masks are worthwhile. Aaron asks, what is austerity? So it's when they cut public services and so on back to the absolute bone, leave stuff, wait for stuff, postpone stuff, and just rein in government spending of all kinds, generally, except military spending, obviously. Trouble is, this just creates problems because it sucks money out of the economy and you need to spend money to make money, and it leads to problems that we've been suffering over the course of austerity, like massively potholed roads, not enough medical capacity, which has come around to bite us in the arse this time, and all kinds of other issues. So yeah, it's budgeting, but the thing is, a country's economy is not like a household economy. So saying things like spend within your means and so on is just meaningless on a national scale, unfortunately. Well, not meaningless, nearly meaningless, or meaningful in a different way, at the very least. But basically, it's big cuts and lack of spending. 10-year death claim, says Ben, it's based on figures from 1 or 2 years that were extrapolated to guesstimate the 10-year death toll, though, so it's not necessarily accurate. There's two separate studies, both of which support roughly the same figure, and it gives us a reasonable benchmark to say, yeah, how many deaths is worth it, I guess. But yeah, as he says, long-term cuts aren't a good thing, regardless of what the actual damage was. Sonic says, what do you expect will happen if the second wave arrives? Even more strict lockdown rules? Will people be willing to go back to that after having had a bit of freedom now? Don't flame me, purely theoretical. I think it will arrive in a week, maybe 2 weeks, after they put out all those confusing messages and kind of relaxed things and then sort of went back on it. People already don't trust the government, so if that happens, I think trust will go even lower, which means people are unlikely to follow instructions anyway, but they're less likely to follow the instructions to go back to work and to go back to normal. So there will always be a hardcore of retarded people who will protest for their right to be bitten by zombies, but I honestly don't know. I would hope that once bitten, twice shy, people will lock down properly if we do get a big second spike. Ben says something like that is going to be very hard to correlate accurately, cuts causing deaths, but who knows, maybe it's even worse than those figures suggested. You can kind of do it by comparing the normal amount of deaths per population outside of that context, but there's so many confounding factors. Yeah, it's difficult. There are several sites dedicated to tracking people who've definitely died due to having their benefits cut, largely driven by austerity and so on. So Aaron says the Cathy Newman spin on the grim statement. So you're saying you'd rather people die than let the Tories stay in power. I think the Tories are causing people to die. So and I think I directly said the opposite. I said, better that people stay alive if it comes down to between the two. But I would like people to live and for the Tories to end up out of power. And unfortunately, they're going to take credit if we do pull off a miracle. Sonic says, I read a news story from the USA this weekend, and there was a biker who died in an accident. He was tested and had COVID, so his death was chalked up to COVID. How much should we believe these articles? Doubtless that will be happening to an extent, but in most countries the COVID deaths are being underreported. Certainly in the UK, our actual death toll is something like double what the recorded death toll is, because the recorded death toll is deaths in hospital, and it's not including care homes and other instances. A lot of stories like that are going around. They tend to be bandied around by right-wing conspiracy theorists as examples to show that the deaths are being inflated. And even if the odd 1 or 2 is true, it doesn't really say anything about the overall numbers, because how many are being missed? How many aren't being recorded? If it's anything like what's happening in the UK, which it probably is. Aaron says, what got me about the figures was some of it was saying people need doctors to tell them to eat better and exercise. And I was like, what? I think that's a kind of long-winded way of saying that poverty and cutbacks has restricted access to doctors and nurses and so on to give health advice more generally. But yeah, that sounds stupid the way it's put, but it's probably actually more. more sensible than it sounds. Aaron says the death count is probably inflated. I'll give you that. As I said, I can't speak entirely for the US, but certainly in the UK, no, it's being massively underreported. The reported deaths are about half. Now, if you really want to get to the data, you probably need to look at the casualty rate as compared to normal. And I do know that the coroner's recorded deaths, where you can get that information in the US, is much higher than the reported corona deaths. And what's the big difference? Coronavirus. So that gives you a far more accurate idea of how many genuine casualties are probably being caused. So I would suggest looking for that. Look at the comparison of the past 5-year average versus this year, and you'll see a massive spike. Now, unfortunately, because of different states and local regulations and so on, you can't get that information for everywhere and tot it all up and get an idea. But you can get at least some idea of what the comparison is. I think you can get New York's data, which is probably the most stark, but New York isn't representative of a lot of the rest of the US. I know you can get the information here in the UK. I've seen Manchester's data. Yeah. Might cause infertility. Yeah, we just don't know what it's causing. This is the problem. We need to know. Too late for Venger. Yeah, he's already spawned way too much. What am I working on today? I am going to try and put together a character creation playtest packet for Grimdark, and otherwise I'll be working on the city setting for Whitechester. And I might be risking a trip into the zombie-infested town for fuel, so that I don't need any until this is all over, hopefully. Aaron says, are you and Pundit going to break up over politics? No, I don't think this is a political issue. This is a healthcare issue. I don't know. He's backed off somewhat, so I might cool off a bit. But I regard his position on coronavirus as being as objectionable to me as anti-vax propaganda. It's essentially the same thing. Fuck you, you can all die, I don't want a jab. Fuck you, you can all die, I want to go and get my hair cut. It's equally irresponsible and insane, frankly. Most of the other stuff about Pundit is overblown. He's a nice enough guy, personally. It's a character that he plays. But this isn't the sort of thing that I can just agree to disagree, because it directly affects people's lives. And his rhetoric is the kind of thing that gets people killed. So, yeah, I can't ignore that. And I've got to be consistent, and I don't want to be a hypocrite on this. Who'd get custody of Venger? Venger's his own man. He can choose which daddy he wants. I think that's about it. Unless there's any last-minute comments, I'll give you a couple of minutes to say that, and then I'd better go and get to work. I started late today. That's because my MechWarrior 5 saves were corrupted, so I had to fix those. Aaron says, yeah, I guess that's true. I hope he doesn't get sick. I hope he doesn't get sick, but then it might give him a bit of a wake-up call. But like I say, he's in URGA, so he's a lot less likely to, unless it gets really out of control there. But we'll see. I haven't seen the Pornhub channel. No. Well, actually, no, I have, because I completed Pornhub during all of this. Got the achievement badge. Right, I should go get to work. Take care, everyone. Stay safe. Wear your mask if you go out. Remain indoors. Zang.